Hi, let's talk about transport. As I said a couple of videos ago, cells are small because they need to be to get stuff in and out of them. But how do they get that stuff in and out? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. When stuff moves in and out of a cell, we call that transport. When it moves in or out of the cell without the cell using energy, we call that passive transport. Passive transport mostly happens because diffusion is a thing. Diffusion is when stuff moves from where there's a lot of it to where there's less of it. For instance, when you put food coloring into a glass of water, the food coloring naturally spreads out until it's evenly distributed throughout the whole glass. That's diffusion. You already know about this, but you don't think about it much. This happens because water is a liquid, and in liquids, molecules move an awful lot. They move all the time and they're bumping into each other all the time. This bumping into each other causes the molecules to get all mixed up. And because of this, stuff always moves from where there's more of it to where there's less of it. And cells use this to their advantage to get stuff in and out of the cell. Osmosis is just a particular kind of diffusion, a kind of diffusion that involves water. It's easy to think about the stuff that's dissolved in the water, but the water molecules themselves have to follow the diffusion rules also. If there's a lot of stuff dissolved in the water, then there's not very much water. If there's not very much stuff dissolved in the water, then there's a lot of water. And water is going to want to move from where there's a lot of it to where there's not very much of it, just the same way that other molecules move from where there's a lot of them to where there's not very many of them. If the water goes through a membrane while it's diffusing, then we call that osmosis. Osmosis is a particular kind of diffusion, the diffusion of water through a membrane. Diffusion works great for things that like to go through the membrane. But some things have a hard time getting through the membrane. They need help. If they need help, we call that facilitated diffusion. There are two kinds of facilitated diffusion. They both use different kinds of proteins. One kind of facilitated diffusion uses a channel protein. A channel protein has a channel in it that allows small molecules that normally wouldn't be able to get through the membrane to get through the membrane. The other kind of facilitated diffusion uses a carrier protein. A carrier protein only bonds to a particular kind of molecule, and it only lets that particular kind of molecule through. It works because when the molecule in question binds to the carrier changes shape and lets that molecule through. Facilitated is just a fancy word for help. It just means diffusion that's helped by these proteins. These kinds of facilitated diffusion are still passive. They go with the concentration gradient from where there's lots of stuff to where there's not very much stuff, and the cell itself doesn't have to use any energy. It just happens because of the natural bumping into each other of the molecules. Remember, stuff wants to move from where there's more of it to where there's less of it, but sometimes the cell needs to get stuff that it already has more of than the environment has. This is against the concentration gradient, and to do that we need even more help. We need energy, and we get that energy in the form of a molecule called ATP, a molecule that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. When we use ATP to move stuff in or out of the cell, we call that active transport. And there are several different kinds of active transport. One kind involves vesicles, little pockets of membrane. And when we use vesicles to move stuff in or out of the cell, we call that endocytosis or exocytosis. Endocytosis is the moving of stuff into the cell by forming those little pockets of membrane and bringing them into the cell. Exocytosis is just the opposite, taking a vesicle that's already in the cell, merging it with the membrane and releasing the stuff. Another kind of active transport is when the carrier protein moves stuff against the gradient, but it requires ATP to do so. It's not diffusion because we're going against the gradient. It's active transport and it requires energy. So cells have to move things, and they can do that with active transport or passive transport. Diffusion and concentration gradients are hugely important to the operations of the cell, and we will revisit this topic. Stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.